that firms like HP and Chevron were beginning to talk among themselves in our corporate affiliates program about their size. There was, the GE had reached the $600 billion level. BP had reached the $300 billion level. They began to ask, are they different when they get that big? So let's reflect on some of these social facts, because there is something rather shocking and rapid about this global consolidation that I'd like to talk with you about. For the first time in human history, of the 100 largest economies in the world, the majority of them, 51, are corporations rather than nation states. And so what that caused me to think was that the things that I trained on when I was thinking about government policy or when I was thinking about equity, such as the wealth of nations, should probably be reconsidered in this new century as about the wealth of corporations. Or a lot of the equity questions that are evolved in our culture regarding the Federalist Papers, we now need to think of them in reference to corporate papers. So in a sense, what I'm going to talk to you about are these massive mansions which unto themselves have great social history and political leverage. One of the greatest facts is, if you think of jumping to number 5, that within the top 300 multinationals, already 40% of world trade occurs. So what that means is 2/5 of the slice of the pizza pie is already occurring within the Walmart and the GE, within the GE and the Lowe's, within the Lowe's and the Home Depot. And so the rest of the world is the other slices of the pie. And there's so many of us that are part of the rest of the world. These 100 largest ones, if you cut it instead of 300 to the 100 largest, they already control 20% of global foreign assets, and that there are now only 21 nations in the world that have GNP markets larger than the annual sales revenue of each of the 6 largest multinationals. So I wanted to pause to see if anybody had questions about this question of consolidation and size. Just this is the fact base before we get to talk what we're talking about. Any concerns? Yes, ma'am. That's why I wanted to bring this up, is because we've always been thinking that consumers have and should have a great deal of leverage on change, but it's the trade, 40% occurring just within these 300 entities, and so it's the HP providing information services to the ExxonMobil selling oil to the Honeywell, and so forth. This is an astonishing development just in the last century. Bill Russell.
The accountant in me has to ask a question about double counting here, to the extent that the economies represented by the companies are also being counted within the economics of the governments, the nations themselves. So to some extent, this power of the company would even be amplified if you started to look at the governments without the companies or with them.
Excellent point, Bill, because if you look at the size of these companies relative to the growing retreat of governments, it's one of the concerns I had in writing the book. And the governments are often counting what you just occurred. Now, on top of this, I wanted to give you another mega fact about human history to see if why I think there's a potential collision occurring here. For the first time in human history, 81% of the people on Earth live within 75 miles of a major city. And so when I come from my hometown of Saratoga to here, we're passing through an urban complex so that 4/5 of the people you'll meet in your day are not rural, all right? And so that's another feature of globalization. And so you got, on the one hand, the size of corporate power that's concentrating, and on the other hand, you have this development of urban complexes. So that everyone in Montville or northern New Jersey is, in a sense, part of 75 miles to New York City. And this is a pattern in Bangladesh, Singapore, throughout the world. Now, what does this mean for the things that I'm going to tell you about? If you would go to the next slide. I really think that we're at this stage where we're at a new frontier. When Turner created the concept 100 years ago of endless westward expansionism, I think we're at a new frontier, which in this book I explore as the S frontier. What I began to look at was three variables. And if you think of this S and you curve it in your mind, in the middle of the S is the price signals and the turbulence of the current market. All right? On the top of the S is the world of how things should be and how things, so the NGO community, the educational institutions, the regulatory authorities, they're moving up to how the world should be. And on the bottom of the S is failure. So when I started my little company in 1981, I put a folder in a file of the Fortune 500. And the first principle I want to convey to you is the severity of global markets. Looking today, as I was finishing World Inc. about a year ago, 63% of those Fortune 500 are no longer present 25 years later. The rapidity and the severity of corporate cleansing, of taking apart firms, is absolutely astonishing, even of these largest ones. And so I wanted to convey this as a World Inc. principle for your Sustainable Institute to think about. So for example, BP buys Amoco and Arco during that phase. Union Carbide is purchased by Dow because they bet the ranch on Bhopal. There is so much change that in the book I talk of it as volcanic, because it really is. And so the most recent example that I want to see if anybody has opinions of the severity of markets is TXU, which has been one of our corporate affiliates. Does anybody recall what's happened to TXU in the last 2 months? It was actually finalized last Wednesday. Matt.
They were going to be sold, but the environmentalists got together with Goldman Sachs and created pressure to stop the sale for global warming reasons.
And essentially what it was TXU had a path of growth plan of 11 coal-fired plants. And the private equity group that has now succeeded in buying them as of last Wednesday for $45 billion had to tell the stakeholder community, the social networks, the government, that they would not build 11 plants, they would instead build 2 plants and find other forms of energy. All right? So we now have the severity of market conditions where a giant classical utility, this is the Texas utility that built the 5 major lakes in Texas, being forced to change by social forces. And so I think the second variable in this S frontier is the incredible swiftness of information. And in fact, this is grounds for hope, in the sense that if you are capable of having 2/3 of the giants cleansed due to inefficiency, and then also have the swiftness of information that's so much faster than regulation. If you could impact TXU in the way that it was impacted in the last 10 months, you are essentially working at 10 to 50 times the speed of regulation. All right, so this is what I mean by the World Inc. frontier. Now these things, yes, John?
I think also interesting that deal is the fact that it was a private equity deal, which probably has a longer time horizon, ironically, than a publicly traded equity would have for those coal plants. So that's probably one of the things that contributes to that. And that's kind of an ironic that you start to see people go back to private equity as opposed to gigantic corporations.
Yeah, I agree with you, John. And you're wondering how can the world become so fast and transparent that that's happening at the same time? So what I begin to argue in the book is if all corporate strategy is like Michael Porter kind of indicates in his work, that it's about the pursuit of product advantage, it's the pursuit of terrain advantage, it's the pursuit of technological advantage, and occasionally it's the pursuit of moral advantage. What I'm seeing is that there's a new kind of capitalism that I want to just help you visualize quickly so we can talk about